All right, it's time to talk some Ohio State football. We've got Claire Crawford on the line. This is a Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And if you like the audio, it's on Google Play, Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher. Claire, how you doing tonight?
I am doing excellent. It's finally spring in Ohio. I didn't think it would ever come. It is. It's officially spring. I think it just went straight to summer, but I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, I'm up in Connecticut, and we have some similar weather challenges to deal with. And if I remember way back to like February, there were like 4 days that it got up into the 70s. And some people it fools me. It fools for a split second. Then I remember, oh, yeah, it does this all the time. And people start talking about spring. And we know that we're still really 2 months away. But yeah, it feels like it's finally arrived. And yeah, it did just shoot into the 80s all of a sudden or close to it. And so that's fine. That's fine. No issue there. Joe Burrow getting himself used to some heat and humidity, I believe, along the bayou. Claire, what surprises me about this situation with Joe Burrow is that I think it was conventional thinking among Ohio State fans, even if it didn't necessarily align with what the coaching staff was thinking, is that Dwayne Haskins showed us that he came into the game, the biggest game of the year, and pulled off a 6-for-7 showing, down by a score, and he played really well under pressure and made the big throws. And therefore, the guy that has a bit of a track record to do it in the big house versus guys that just show it in practice has to have a major advantage in this competition. Then it seems like as we moved through the spring and got some reports from spring practice and saw what we saw in the spring game, it's not like Burrow necessarily outplayed Haskins, but that there were reports out there all over the place that, okay, Burrow's actually the guy. He's actually the better player. And I thought he was going to stick around and fight this thing through all the way to the end. And so I was a bit surprised when he finally made that decision.
I think Ohio State fans were somewhat surprised. And I don't think that there was any gamesmanship on Urban Meyer's part to really string Joe Burrow along and make it seem like it's possible that he was going to start over Haskins. I really, truly think that obviously Joe Burrow is a very talented quarterback, and I think he would have been a great quarterback starting at Ohio State. I think there were certain factors with his injury, breaking his hand, and then obviously what you mentioned, what we saw out of Haskins in that Michigan game. Not only did we see him make the big throws, like you mentioned, but we saw confidence in him, confidence that he had no business having at that point in time. I mean, and he lived up to all the things that you and I had speculated about Dwayne Haskins and what we might see out of him. But I think also as Ohio State fans, we've been steeled to the thought that, you know, we're not going to be wooed by a performance or two by a second string quarterback, also known as Cardale Jones syndrome. So we've seen somebody step in and have these incredible performances and then go on to have either, lackluster seasons or for reasons, him swapping in with JT constantly and a multitude of other reasons that may have led to Cardale underperforming the following year. It definitely, I think, not gave everyone pause, but just had everybody pump the brakes. Like, if Urban is saying that Joe really does have a chance to be a starter, we're going to take his word for it, because obviously we saw Dwayne Haskins and what he can do. And there's no question that we should have faith in him going forward. But the reports coming for Joe Burrow, we tended to believe in it.
All right, Claire, we've got a number of comments on the chat.
Already.
Not necessarily anything I'm going to pass on, because a lot of Ohio State detractors out there. So we have our critics, of course. And then we also have Dennis Wilson, who tells us that Michigan is finally going to beat Ohio State in 18. And a lot of people that are going all the way back to the January of 2003 game against Miami and still lamenting the game and disputing the call.
That's tough. Yeah. You and I have had entire full-on segments about that specific call and that specific game. So if they want, I'm sure if you scroll through Mark Rogers TV's the annals of Mark Rogers TV's library, you will see Mark and I, and I'm sure Mark on his own, discussing very much clarity exactly not just that play, but the play before, right, Mark?
Yes, I try to keep it current. Yes, I love to talk college football history, and when that place is available for us to go ahead and do that, if we have cause to do that, and of course, May's a good time to do it. But my approach here tonight was to talk about the 2018 Buckeyes and a few different issues going on, and of course the Joe Burrow transfer. But yeah, the folks, they just love to take it back to those old grudges each and every time.
When that's all you got, that's what you got to do. I for one, it's always possible that Ohio State and Michigan, either one of those teams can win. That's why it's such an amazing rivalry. You truly don't know. As an Ohio State fan, it doesn't matter what the season looks like ahead of time. It doesn't matter what they've done leading up to that game. That's why the rivalry is the game. THE, big capital letters, the game. It's the greatest rivalry in all of sports. I'm sure that there are plenty of Michigan fans that will make a case for Shea Patterson and what he's going to do. And I'm sure, we sent one down to the SEC. They send one up. But Jim Harbaugh should probably plan more trips to Indianapolis than he does overseas. I'm just saying.
And I may, in fact, have a conversation with Steve Dace from Michigan Podcast about Shea Patterson tonight. We talk from time to time. So Steve has just contacted me just the last few minutes. So we'll see if Steve wants to talk Michigan football. But the roster is really good. They will have to come to Columbus.
Yes.
And the drought has been long and dry for the maize and blue.
It has. Shea Patterson has a lot of potential. He's got a big arm. He has a lot of accuracy. What I just see from my point of view as an analyst is sometimes a lack of pocket presence, or when things break down, sometimes Shea Patterson breaks down a little too quickly. And this is his fourth offense he's seen in as many years. So hopefully they can get him on board, get him assimilated, and get him doing what he needs to do in order to make that successful. I mean, he has all the potential in the world to do so. I think 100% I believe he has the potential to do so, but they have their work cut out for them.
Yeah, a really good player out of Ole Miss who only has about 8 or 10 starts under his belt, but against very good defenses for the most part in the SEC, in which he played very well. Reminds people of Franz Harkington, Russell Wilson, Johnny Manziel to a certain extent.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, he's got that feel. He's got the playmaking ability to an extent where he's not so wild and loose with the football that he makes a ton of mistakes, but he takes a few risks, but he's got the skill and the talent and the elusiveness to make it most of the time.
Same size as the guys that you mentioned for the most part, too. He's just a hair over 6 foot. So I think that's one of the things that you see with smaller quarterbacks, and you're seeing even out of the Browns camp, what's happening there and how a certain quarterback is getting used to things there. And the same thing, they're just saying he's getting used to having to find new lanes. And I think that's just a product of lacking some height or size.
We always love the discussion with Claire Crawford. You can join her on Twitter at Claire, no E, Claire, Clair.
Buckeye
Crawford.
Claire.
It's Buckeye Claire, no E.
No E.
So for some fun sports talk and a lot of other good stuff there, join Claire on Twitter. And also we have our discussions here on YouTube on my channel. And this is the first time that, and Claire is showing herself to be a true professional, as she is not distracted by me checking out the chat constantly. And this is the first time that we've had the chat on while Claire and I have talked. So Martin Rosario. Okay. Mark and Claire, it wasn't pass interference. Stop it. 99% of the country already agrees with this outside of Columbus. And I will disclaim that I cleaned up about 4 grammatical errors while I was reading that, and typically have to. So
that was Justin.
Claire, do you mind if I take this one?
Oh, I love it when you take this one. This is my favorite thing for you to pontificate about. I think this is beautiful because you break it down so very technically.
Martin, you are so right. That was not pass interference. That was absolutely not pass interference against Miami. It should have been called correctly. It was holding, is what it was. So the Ohio State receiver, Chris Gamble, came off the line and he passed the 5-yard threshold, and he was clearly grabbed by both arms, jersey in clenched fists by the defender, and he was held up. That was holding. Because of where Ohio State was positioned on the field, the result of that penalty would have been just about exactly the same yardage and conversion to a first down if it would have been called correctly. Holding versus pass interference. End result, Ohio State still with a first down at the 1 or 2 yard line, and they score. Then they score again to take the lead. Then they stop Miami and they win the game. Now, what wasn't called pass interference that should have been was Ohio State's final possession of regulation. The aforementioned Chris Gamble, he's running an out. Ohio State's got 3rd and 5. They've got a 3-point lead, 17-14. There's about 3 and change left, actually less than that. And Ohio State needs about 2 first downs to kill the clock. If they get a first down and it still have to punt, they leave Miami with little time. Gamble's coming out of his break. He's held by his jersey, number 1, pass interference, with the ball in the air. And number 2, he actually caught the ball in bounds. And if you watch the TV replay with the immortal Keith Jackson and Dan Fouts on the mic, they actually point out not only did Chris Gamble actually catch the ball in bounds, but he was held in the process of reaching for the football while it was in the air. And that should have been called pass interference, would have been first down Ohio State. They would have kept the ball and maybe run out the clock. If nothing else, they would have kept the ball, advanced it down the field another 10 to 15 yards, punted, and Miami would have had little time to drive down the field and kick the field goal that sent it into overtime. So, Martin, you are correct. That should not have been called pass interference against Miami. It should have been holding. And yes, you need to check out Ohio State's last drive of regulation in which pass interference should have been called.
Thank you. That's literally the best explanation anyone's ever given, and there's no argument there.
So there we go. No, I would like to move forward to 2018 and discuss Ohio State football here.
It's easier for Ohio State fans to do so.
And I understand the anguish of having an undefeated team and being defending national champions and coming oh so close and being such a heavy favorite and believing that you have a dominant team that's going to win easily. The game could have gone either way. That's typically what happens in overtime games. It's really close. So I understand the anguish of that, but every program that's an elite program has those moments in its history where they feel as though, wow, we should have won that. We blew that. It's happened to every program in America.
Including Ohio State.
Absolutely. There's a lot of those for the Buckeyes, and we've lamented those in the past. We're actually going to get back on course with this quarterback situation because, Claire, these wide receivers that Ohio State has, they're loaded with talent, and they do make plays. They don't seem to have made the kind of plays in the crucial situations that their predecessors did in 14 and 15. The likes of course, Devin Smith and Jalen Marshall, Michael Thomas, who's now a great NFL wide receiver. He started a historic run just in his first 2 years with the New Orleans Saints, but still a load of wide receivers. And it's just and Urban Meyer basically brought this approach to him from Florida, that instead of having a couple star wide receivers that catch 80 passes, he loves to rotate them and play a lot of guys. Obviously, there's a limitation to that. There's you need to have some level of continuity. So your thoughts about the Ohio State wide receiver rotation and how that has to work with now what is Dwayne Haskins being the starting quarterback?
Sure. And I know it's a little unconventional. Quarterbacks, wide receivers coach Zach Smith, according to Urban's offense and Zach's philosophy, is that they've got this 6-man rotation, and Ohio State has this embarrassment of riches at wide receiver, which is a lucky thing that they can do a 6-man rotation. And it does afford them a little bit of, it makes it more difficult for defenses to plan around that. I think at least 2 or 3 guys always end up stepping up above others, and there are certain go-to receivers. However, the 6-man rotation, we really haven't seen a new quarterback have to step in and assimilate to that since 2014. And it's going to be a situation where also Greg Studrawa has mentioned that he had an interest in rotating the offensive line, which was not, it's first of all, it's an unconventional philosophy. You can rotate at depth at any other position. It's extremely unconventional to rotate at offensive line. That is a unit that is just contingent upon people being having consistency and gelling and whatever word that you want to use for that group of guys really needing to be consistent. To rotate in on depth is something that's really not super conventional. So Studrawa is saying that he's seen it work other places. He believes that Ohio State has enough talent to do so. He also believes that it's an ability to get guys playing time in less competitive games. And it really says a lot, I think, about Dwayne Haskins, that they are willing to rotate an offensive line and willing to heavily rotate a wide receivers unit, and have Dwayne step in, and they're saying he can handle it. I think it is going to be mutually beneficial to all 3 of those units if it works. And if it doesn't, they're going to have to take it out almost like when you've got a food allergy and you just start taking like little things out. If this offense is like crumbling or bursting at the seams, they're going to have to start picking those things apart one by one. And the last thing that they're going to pick apart is the quarterback. So I think they're going to, first of all, continue with the situation with rotating in these wide receivers. Ben Victor and Austin Mack. They're really, for the first time, we're seeing more size out of these Ohio State receivers. They're going to be able to be more physical, great hands. And we're seeing a lot out of Dwayne Haskins as far as we've talked about and used the euphemism gunslinger with him before. So I think these receivers being big bodied and being able to maybe be more physical with a defensive back is going to really be important with someone who might be throwing the ball up for somebody.
Yeah, I think they've got a pretty good mix of guys that are the burner. So Johnny Dixon's the burner. They've got the guys that you mentioned, Benjamin Victor, who's a rail thin guy who's starting to fill out. We've seen it a little bit more this past season than when he showed up on campus. The first year is like looked like he was like 6'2", 170. He was just rail thin, and they've bulked him up a little bit, if that's the way you want to term it. And maybe they could probably get some advice from you, Claire, in regards to what to put Benjamin Victor on.
Food and weights. Lift heavy, eat food. That's all there is to it.
There it is. That's what you have to do. I've heard about football players that have had that issue where they've gone to the extent of actually having to set an alarm in the middle of the night to get up and eat.
That's what bodybuilders do. And these guys are so young and they're working so hard. It would be really difficult for them to overeat in all reality. They are in such a calorie deficit that they really could eat whatever they want. Luckily, on the Ohio State staff, and I've actually sat down and talked to some of their nutritionists, and I have the greatest respect for Mickey Marotti. He runs an incredible strength program there, and they have just top-notch nutritionists. You'll see a difference in even kind of streamlining the trenches. And we still call it offensive line slobs, but they really are guys that are trim and strong and fast, but obviously still able to use the physicality.
So again, that's Dixon on the outside. Paris Campbell, also a burner. We saw him take one the distance against Wisconsin. Nobody could keep up with him. Underneath, the guy that's kind of the X factor, not in regards to X factor. He's a wild card. We don't know what he's going to do, but he's different than the rest of them. Is KJ Hill? He's the underneath guy, the guy that's small and quick in space and really can juke and jive and catch the ball in space and make those guys miss. And the other guys are kind of long and lean, and Austin Mack's a big body guy as well. So should be interesting to see what we get out of the Buckeyes at the wide receiver position with this new philosophy and this new rotation, both at offensive line and at wide receiver, that keeps guys fresh. Maybe something that needs to be reviewed in regards to finding that balance of keeping guys fresh and maintaining continuity and having the best guys on the field at the right times.
I think so too. And you mentioned KJ. I think we're still going to see a lot of KJ on special teams, along with Demario McCall. They've kind of announced that he's going to be a specialty, kind of a return specialist. And I think that is a great move for both of those guys. And I definitely think that it's going to make a difference in the fabric of this offense, and making it a little more complex. And like you mentioned, with rotating the guys, I think we're going to see a lot of that in the less competitive games, like I mentioned. And I think that's pretty commonplace. What we haven't seen is it when it really comes down to the moments that actually matter. And I don't think it's just so they can get guys playing time, which I do think is a philosophy that has worked on the defensive side of the ball. But like we mentioned before, with offense, it really takes a lot of gelling to make that work and to make that happen. So I can't use the word unconventional enough, but if it works, which it has, according to our guys at 11 Warriors for Clemson and for the New England Patriots. So I think those are two pretty successful offenses, and they'll continue to do so. So I think if they're going to take a model from someone, those aren't two bad models.
Got someone on the chat who's likening Jim Harbaugh's performance against Ohio State to John Cooper versus Michigan. Just kind of flipping it around there.
Those were tough years. Those were tough years as an Ohio State fan to live through. I'd say the difference is bowl performances as far as John Cooper and Jim Harbaugh. I would say how those two are not alike in that way. But otherwise, obviously, John Cooper had well, we don't know how long Jim Harbaugh's tenure is, but we have a bigger sample size from John Cooper.
Absolutely. So if you're under the age of whatever, you don't know much about John Cooper. John Cooper went had a nice run at Ohio State. He took over a program that was hurting at the time, so he got off to a slow start because the program only won 4 games the year before, or he won 4 games his first year after the program only won 6 games. So there was a bit of a lull there, and took him a few years to get going. Once he got going, he was beating everyone in sight, except Michigan, and that's a problem when you wear scarlet and gray.
Ask Rich Rodriguez and Brady Hoke.
Yeah. So 2-10-1 against Michigan.
That is unacceptable.
And I believe 3-8 is the bowl count. So it was difficult for John Cooper. So his last several seasons, he did have some extremely good teams, 95, 96, 98 in particular, that only lost one time, but they lost at the wrong time. They lost to Michigan. And then they turned around and won Sugar Bowls and Rose Bowls, and 2 of them finished number 2 in the country. But as we have mentioned, if any coach in the history of college football, and I'm sure there's several handfuls that we could point to, if there's one that you could say, change 3 games in a career that spans 13 years, 150 games roughly, choose 3 games. You completely change the narrative, and he's a legend, and he's got 2 or 3 national championships.
I think there are a few coaches at Ohio State. They can point to Michigan State as games that they could do over possibly. and changed the entire just complexion of Ohio State football and college football. Michigan State really has done a lot of damage over the years, and as much as obviously Michigan is Ohio State's rival, Michigan State has done a lot of ruining as well.
Yeah, they have. So go back to Cooper's 1998 team. They actually beat Michigan and they won the Sugar Bowl. So they should have been fine there. But yeah, Michigan State and Nick Saban tripped them up when they were consensus #1. And then, of course, Urban Meyer, maybe arguably his two worst losses, most damaging losses
100%.
were 2013. He's lined up ready to go to a national championship game. They come back from 17 down. They take a touchdown lead against Michigan State. They blow it in the fourth quarter. They lose that game, and Michigan State goes to the Rose Bowl, and somebody else, Auburn, goes to the BCS championship game. And then in 2015, of course, I think that's the one that really stings Ohio State fans because the 2013 team might not have been quite ready for that stage against Jameis Winston. It still would have been nice to have a shot, obviously, as an undefeated Big Ten champion. But the 15 team was coming off the 14 championship. So those guys all proved what they could do against the best teams under pressure, and they just didn't get the opportunity because they tripped up on a sloppy, rainy day in Columbus on a last-second field goal.
Yes. And if you're looking as a Michigan State fan for a bright spot in the entire history of your football program, it had to have been beating Michigan with 0 time on the clock and then beating Ohio State with 0 time on the clock. I'm back to back. It had to be just one of the brightest spots in Michigan State football history.
All right, folks, we're on the line with Claire Crawford. We always love the college football conversation, talking Buckeyes with Claire. And you can join her on Twitter at Buckeye Claire. Drop the E. It's like dropping an M. No E. Don't get that wrong.
Don't do it.
Don't you dare do it. And for those of you that are on the chat talking up Miami football, you are going to be sorely, sorely disappointed that my 7:30 with Alonzo Oliver has been canceled. Talking Miami football. They love for me to talk Miami football, and a number of them had commented, Claire, that Alonzo would be on here in just a few minutes to put me in my place over this whole Miami Ohio State thing.
Okay.
But no Miami talk tonight. We may do a little Michigan talk instead, and we've got some UCLA later.
Just as happy.
Yeah, that's always an interesting one too. So. All right. We mentioned Earle Bruce, or we mentioned John Cooper's career. Of course, his predecessor was Earle Bruce, who, despite on paper a similar showing than John Cooper, maybe didn't even reach the heights that a couple John Cooper teams did. Much more beloved by Ohio State fans because he had a winning record in bowl games and against Michigan. That's the big one. So Urban Meyer speaks just so highly of Earle Bruce. He was a graduate assistant under Earle Bruce, and Coach Bruce passed away just a few weeks ago, and I would be remiss not to get your thoughts, Claire, on Earle Bruce's passing.
It's a huge blow to Buckeye Nation, and there really is a hole in the heart of Buckeye Nation. And as you implied, Earle Bruce had not necessarily given the fairest shake, but I think part of it is that he had very, very, if not the biggest shoes to fill. And, I remember Chris Spielman talking about Earle Bruce's last game and how all of his players loved him. Every single person that's ever played for him has had nothing but glowing things to say about him. He was always an advocate for Ohio State and for student athletes, and really was just this hard charging soul of Ohio State football. And obviously his grandson, Zach Smith, the wide receivers coach, and his family, I'm sure that they are really just it's a tragic way to lose a family member to start with, but to know how much he means to Buckeye Nation and to hopefully carry it on that legacy has to be bittersweet.
Earle Bruce was on Woody Hayes' coaching staff. Uh, Actually, despite the rivalry and what we, for those Ohio State fans out there that think of Michigan, actually, Steve Day's Michigan podcast, last time he was on a few weeks ago, told a hilarious story that I won't try to steal or repeat here. If you go to my last conversation with Steve Dace of Michigan podcast, a very telling story of the relationship Woody Hayes and Earle Bruce had, and just the character that Woody Hayes was, and it involved Earle Bruce coming up through the ranks and on Woody Hayes' coaching staff on a recruiting trip. It was hilarious. So Earle Bruce learned from the best, and then he goes and does some good work at Iowa State in particular. Goes to Ohio State, ironically, in the wake of the firing of Woody Hayes, his mentor.
Right.
And he comes back, and Ohio State had a very young team with a quarterback who, as a freshman, threw 4 touchdowns and 21 interceptions, but was the highly touted, highly rated Art Schlichter. And they went on an undefeated run in 1979 unexpectedly. They were unranked in the preseason and came within 1 point, where we were talking about near misses, right, Claire?
Right. See?
1 point of a national championship in 1979, losing to one of the most talented teams you're ever going to see assembled on a college football field, with NFL Hall of Famers galore, several of them playing for USC and Ohio State. USC, it was a great game, 17-16. And then Earle Bruce actually had the preseason #1 team at Ohio State the next year, but they lost 3 games. And he was tagged with kind of a 9-3 label. He ran off 6 consecutive 9-3 seasons with good teams that looked like, especially in the aftermath of looking at the likes of Chris Spielman and Chris Carter and Pepper Johnson and all sorts of great players. Tremendous offensive line play, and some really good secondary players as well. Keith Byers, of course, at running back, that Mike Tomczak, a starting quarterback in the NFL for a long time, that they would have done better, but just seemed to trip up and still finished top 10, 15 in the country, but not quite do elite work there. And then Earle Bruce's final team, after he won a Cotton Bowl and famously donned a fedora and a suit out of his response of feeling a bit disrespected in light of the media attention given to Jackie Sherrill prior to the Cotton Bowl, and Jackie Sherrill always dressing to the nines, and Earle Bruce was your basic, ball cap and just the windbreaker, or the sweatshirt or whatever, but typically the windbreaker, the Ohio State gear on, that he came out of the locker room, unbeknownst to his team, who saw him in his regular gear in the locker room. He hits the field in the suit and tie, very, very well dressed. And the Buckeyes went on to win the Cotton Bowl. And that's what he wore the next season, which turned out to be his final season. And the Buckeyes took him home to victory in upsetting Michigan on the road in his final game, with the famous Earle headbands across their brows as they played a very inspired game in upsetting Michigan. All right, Claire. Ohio State football. We've got a lot of to talk about coming up in the next several months. So certainly we invite you back, and always love the discussion with you.
Thanks so much for having me on. As always, somehow we always get wrapped up in some fun historical conversation or debate, but those are my favorite.
All right. It's at Buckeye Claire.
Noe.
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
Don't you dare. All right, Claire, you have a great night, and we will see you soon.
Thank you. You do the same.